Welcome everyone to the Liberation Lab YouTube channel and those of you on LinkedIn. I am honored to have my guest, Dr. Deonna Smith. Listen, we are going to be talking about her work, Rooted
Yay.
in Joy. If you have not got a copy, I need you to get it now. But we're going to be talking so much about the gems embedded in here and her journey. So without further ado, please introduce your brilliance, who you are to the people, so we can get started.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited. Happy Black History Month, of course, to all my
Let them
folks out
know.
there. My name is Dr. Deonna Smith, and I am a former teacher, school leader who is passionate about creating joyful, equitable, and inclusive spaces in our classrooms. And I work with teachers and other stakeholders across the country to make that happen, to ensure that our classrooms are spaces where our students can thrive. And so that's just a little bit about my work and my book, Rooted in Joy. I'm excited to chat about it today. It helps folks along that journey and is really kind of a text that's meant to guide you as you explore what it really does look like to build a community that's rooted in joy.
So good. Um, it's so funny to think about this book and this work on the heels of how I started in education. And so I actually today, before this conversation, recorded with a colleague of mine who taught next door to me at my first school.
Oh,
And we were
wow.
recounting like how we were trained. And I was handed a book called Teach Like a Champion. In that book, there were a lot of things that were given to me that were, and I will say this on this side, I will say not everything in that book is terrible, right?
Mhm.
Like it did give you some things that you needed to be able to look through, think through. But when you are doing that in an environment of just high control and no compassion, high compliance, and no regard for the humanity of our babies, it becomes a very problematic thing. So
Absolutely.
I'm saying that to say it is almost like, and I don't want to put one thing versus the other because this is your work and I want it to stand alone. But for me, it was like you're giving life to and giving a process that kind of undoes the damage for me personally that I
Yeah.
went through in that type of instructional growth
Yeah.
and leadership. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And I mean, I'm thrilled that that popped into your head because I had the exact same experience. That's how I was taught to teach. That's the book that I was given in my teacher education program. That's the book that I was evaluated on. And like you said, it's not that the book overall is all bad, but my definition of teaching like a champion is not building a classroom that's rooted in control. So this book is really meant to be a text that guides teachers through reimagining what that needs to look like and recognizing that our classrooms can be productive, can be safe, but they don't have to be carceral. And so I really I'm glad that that's how it landed with you because I do want to really encourage folks, especially new teachers and people that have challenges, to move away from this really narrow perception of what good instruction and good classroom culture looks like and move towards a space rooted in joy. So if
Yeah.
that parallel made sense to you, that's absolutely part of what informed the design. So I'm excited that that's coming across to folks.
Absolutely. You said something that I wanted to highlight, so I'm going to take you right to your work here.
Good, yeah.
And you said many practices in our classroom are informed by carceral practices and ways of thinking. Because of this, many common practices that teachers employ are not equitable and end up perpetuating isms like racism or sexism. Now, that's a bar. You said a lot in that one sentence.
Said a lot.
When folks get into education, and they become a teacher, more times than not, they come in and they say, I just love kids. I love teaching. I love the aha moments. That's joyful, particularly my elementary crew. There's colors and rainbows and everything's great.
Yeah.
Middle school, we're a different breed. Shout out to anybody who's doing that, right? Um, but all throughout, there's this common thread of carceral practice. Now, somebody might hear that and say, "What do y'all mean? What is that? What does that look like? How can we open up someone's eyes who may not even be seeing that right now?"
Yeah, I think the first thing that's important to recognize is that as a teacher, you are still a part of a broader societal narrative and societal stories, and we end up reproducing those in our classrooms. Our classrooms are like tiny little microcosms of what's going on in the outside world. And what a lot of folks do understand when it comes to things like instruction is that schools are designed to be one size fits all, but that doesn't always work. And so when you want to make sure that kids are fitting into this one size fits all narrative, what do? You have punishments and consequences and all of that to try to push people to behave in that way. And so when we think about how our kids are at school, just the way that their bodies are, the way that they move, the way that they're expected to sit, the way that they're expected to enter, all of that is not necessarily informed by recognizing the humanity and the diversity that they bring, but rather making sure that they're conforming to a very specific script and narrative about what we think it is, the way that it should be. So that's where the carceral practices come in. It's very kind of like uniform. You have to be this way. This is the way that you do it. And a lot of folks don't know about the deep embedded history that exists between our prison system and our schools. If you're not familiar, I would highly recommend Michelle Alexander, The New Jim Crow, as one, or even Punished for Dreaming by Dr. Bettina Love. Both great books that illuminate the ways that the prison industrial complex does interact with the education system, and that those two do inform from each other. Even if you think about the words that we use, like I've heard people say, oh, he's one of our repeat offenders, right, for behaviors, or, kicking kids out, or detention and suspension. All of those things are very like carceral practices, and they're not necessarily humanizing. So whether or not it is your intention, because of how we understand school and because of the way that schools were designed, we end up replicating those same practices in our classrooms.
Absolutely, to the point where our our metric of understanding or perceiving great teaching has more to do with compliance and more to do with um, silent and compliant
Mhm.
children than it has to do with the actual knowledge acquisition, the mastery of skill. Like, I think about learning, and every time I get something new, or like I read something that resonates, or they give me language to something, I'm I'm responding with a certain level of joy, like, oh, like
Right.
there's
Right.
emotion, and it's almost like we've kind of moved the emotion out of it. Like, you can show up, but don't get too excited.
Mhm.
But also don't go too far back, because if you do that, then you're not engaged, and I got to call your parent, and I got to do all these different things. And so it's this weird space
Mhm.
of telling kids to show up, but don't be too much of who you are or
Themselves.
how you
Right.
show up. Don't be too much of yourself at
Yeah,
all.
and I think like one example is our obsession with a quiet classroom. Every
Yes.
teacher in America has seen an evaluation rubric that includes like kids were working quietly, or it was quiet, or something about noise control. We spend a lot
Yep.
of time talking about controlling the amount of noise that comes out of children's mouths.
Yeah.
And to the point where, at one point we have to step back and be like, is it reasonable to think that a 6-year-old isn't going to have something to say?
Mm.
But our evaluation criteria is heavily informed, and what we have created in our minds about what a good teacher is somebody whose students are compliant. 9 times out of 10, it's related to compliance. It's not related to learning. It's not related to making kids feel welcome, seen, or valued, because we don't use those metrics. So we don't measure that really
Yep.
conclusively. What we measure the most is behavior infractions, and then standardized testing. So because we don't have a mechanism for measuring those things, a lot of times those are just undervalued. And so it's kind of a feedback loop where teachers are not supported in creating a classroom that disrupts these ideas, and then also teachers are sometimes punished for having like a noisy, high energy, loud classroom. And so then of course it deters them from investigating into how to make that happen further, because they're worried about their evaluations, or their school districts are overwhelmingly preoccupied with standardized testing scores. So it's hard to do anything else when you feel like that's what your job really depends on.
Yeah. It's interesting to think about it too. Like, being on this side, of school leadership, it is the innate pressure to perform according to metrics that won't necessarily best serve you.
Mhm.
So I have to um while I'm working for change, kind of be complicit in a system that I'm trying to change. And
Yes.
so there's this dual consciousness that I'm kind of working with.
Mhm.
And in some spaces, it is hard because I know that I would much rather us foster what you're talking about in your book, a culture of belonging. I would much rather focus on, have we made this inclusive? Are we thinking about who's not yet here? Are we asking and interrogating, who's get removed from our classrooms and why? Are we doing that? Or are we just okay with
Mhm.
making it through the day and getting our 3 on the Danielson, because give me a 3 and then go away, right?
Right, right. And it's a difficult line for a lot of teachers to walk. And usually when I'm working with folks, especially stakeholders like district leaders or school leaders, what I implore them to recognize is the way that we're doing it now isn't working anyway. And so
That
there's a
part.
lot of fear about, well, what if we do this joy thing and it impacts standardized test scores? Or what if what if we stop having detention and this and that happens? And I'm kind of like, what we're doing right now isn't working exceedingly well either. So at
Right.
this point, trying something new should not be as scary as it is. I think, especially in a air quote, post pandemic world, we've seen that it's not working. So it's interesting to me that there's so much resistance to try something new, as if, our current systems are doing so well. But whatever metric you look at, whether it's belonging for those schools that do measure belonging, whether it's standardized test scores, whether it's retention, whether it's parent satisfaction, our schools are not meeting standards, right? They're not yet approaching where they need to be. And so I think that this is really the time for innovation and for teachers to be bold and open to disrupt.
It's very interesting because this is said, and I agree with you wholeheartedly. This is said against a backdrop, and I don't know if you've seen this, but there's been a lot of conversation, particularly on TikTok and in places where we're having conversations about what students don't know,
Mm,
and teachers are in spaces of in this TikTok world where they are recording themselves talking about what students can't do by what grade level, right? And in a sense, I get it
mhm.
because we've told teachers in so many different ways that it's their fault, that kids can't do, that kids haven't learned. And so if I'm a teacher, I'm going to reject that. I'm going to fight back. I'm going to tell you, no, parents, you can't read with your kid for 15 minutes a day. You can't do X, Y, and Z. You're doing all of these things. Um, and it makes sense to me that those things are the crux of our conversation. However, and this is where I want to kick it to you. For me, my problem is we've lost, it seems, our obsession with our craft, our obsession
Yeah,
with being experts about what we do, and our obsession with that aha moment, getting kids to learn. Like this like I dream of being a part of a building where people are building school district ethos of where we are committed. You come in my classroom, there's not an option. You are going to learn, because if you don't get it this way, I'm gonna try it that way. If you don't
right.
get it this way, I'm gonna change my approach. We are going to get it together, and you're gonna be a part of that. And I wonder why that is so less common.
Yeah, yeah.
So talk to me about that. Like, because you're challenging us here, but I think it's set against a backdrop of people saying like, nah, these kids can't do, and teachers are kind of rebelling against it.
Yeah, I mean, and there's so much I don't want to say about this. First of all, social media and teaching is at a very interesting intersection right now. And I
Yeah.
think that while I understand the need to vent, it's a little concerning to me that teachers seem to be unaware that our students are also actively using social media along with us and can see what we're posting about them. So there's that piece there. But I also think a lot of different things are happening. One, I think that we as a society would like to believe that kids don't want to learn because we see the iPads and we see the TikTok, and we shake our fists and do the kids these days thing. But I just refuse to believe that that's true. And I know this to be true because I have seen young kids excited about learning. Talk to a kindergartner. Kindergartners love their teachers. They love school. They're curious. They're excited. They're enthusiastic. Talk to a middle schooler. You cannot usually say any of those things. They do not love school. They do not love their teachers. And so some of that is the schools. And at one point, you have to realize, this is what I always say, schools are so preoccupied with trauma informed care. Baby, sometimes we are the trauma. It's the school that's the trauma. So schools are sucking a lot of this joy. They're doing what Dr. Love would call spirit murdering our students.
That part.
And a lot of the reasons why you see middle schoolers that can't identify a triangle is because look at what they've been expected to deal with in the education system. It's demoralizing. It's not exciting. It's not engaging. And we perpetuate that cycle because we tell ourselves these lies about students, which is that they can't. We don't even give them an opportunity to prove us wrong. Our curriculum has been so watered down. Not only are they taking Dr. King out of the curriculum, Susan B. Anthony out of the curriculum in Texas, but they're taking all of the inquiry out of it because it's this obsession with doing well on a standardized test. Yeah. So as a 10-year-old, I don't know. I don't blame some of them. Of course, your iPad is more interesting. Of course, I'd rather play Among Us than hear a whitewashed version of history that I have to just sit and listen to, and I can't play with a manipulative. I can't get up out of my seat. I can only go to the bathroom one time a day. I get 1 15-minute recess, and I have to sit quietly and eat a lunch that I don't like. I mean, and then it's like, come on, they're children. What are you expecting them to do? And so I think there's a lot of pieces to this that are working together. And I refuse to go for the easy, low-hanging fruit that kids just don't want to learn, because that's just not my experience. What is my experience is that our teachers are not equipped with the tools that is the mastery, the craft of instruction. Our teachers are, I don't know what's going on in these teacher education programs. Everybody's coming out with just ideas, theories. Maybe they know how to manage behavior, but they don't know how to build community. Or maybe they know how to tell information, but telling and covering curriculum is not the same as teaching it. And that doesn't mean that anybody heard what you were saying. So, and it's not the teacher's fault. I really blame a lack of mentorship in our school buildings. I blame administrators, and I blame the teaching credentialing programs as well, because our teachers don't have the skills to do that. And so at one point, as much as it would be nice that every parent has an hour to read with their child or to go over the letters and the sounds, that would be great. But if you have a 6th grader that can't do something or an 8th grader that can't read, I'm just wondering, like, at one point, do we ask, okay, well, you were at the school that you were at the whole time. Like, why are you telling that to the kids? Shouldn't you be talking to like the school board? Like, is it like, what school were they in? It's not necessarily all on the students. So are our kids disengaged? Yes. Is technology partially to blame? Absolutely. Is the pandemic partially to blame? Absolutely. But there are ways that we can mitigate that. And for teachers that are willing to dig into this work and reject that narrative and, kind of zoom out a little bit, I think that there are ways. Well, I know that there are ways, because this is my job. I talk to you guys about the ways that you can make it possible in your classrooms. So while I do think it's helpful to vent, I'm an external processor. Like, I get it, venting about kids these days. I do think it's reached a point where it's a little bit toxic and we're kind of losing the plot a little bit, because the main thing that we need to be thinking about is like bringing back the mastery in the art of teaching, differentiation, explaining things in different ways, getting in there, getting scrappy, leaning down at the desk, using examples, all of that, like really juicy stuff. I don't see a lot of that anymore, honestly. And I think that has more to do with it than anything.
Yeah. It's the craft of teaching, the art, like you're talking about. I'm looking at students who, there's a very much so like an entertain me kind of understanding of things, right? And so if I'm not entertained, then I'm not necessarily engaged. And so I think that there's some of that we have to battle against. But by and large, the average classroom, I'm going to say, there are shifts that we can make that will maximize the impact that we can have.
Yes.
And much like you're talking about, a lot of it starts with our mindsets, right? When I go in to talk to a school and we're talking about restorative practices, for example, and they want to talk to me about whether or not that they believe their school is restorative because they had it on their website and things like that. And I show them, hey, let's let's look at the data. One, two, let's before you even look at the data, let's look at your current code of conduct. You don't
Mhm.
even have restorative language in your code of conduct. So how are you going to build a restorative school when you don't even have it in the very documents
Right.
that you say guide you, right? And in the same way, when we talk about mindset shifts, you get into a lot of that aspect of things, how we need to believe better in order to actually do this thing called uh, education and do it in a way that you're talking about. To
Mhm.
do that though, I want to back up for a second because the mindset you arrive at started way before you became an educator.
Yes.
Started before there was the DR in front of your name. Shout out to you, by the way.
Thank you.
Um, let's talk about your journey in education.
As a
Let's
student?
talk as a student, K to 12.
Okay, let's do it.
In that experience, for me, I'm gonna put my cards on the table. School was survived more than thrived.
Mm.
And you would not get that from my grades because my grandma and my mom would whip my behind, and I needed to have A's and B's. So you would never see it,
Yup.
but that was my experience. Like I didn't feel like this was for me. That was mine. But
Yeah.
but talk to me about yours. What was your K to 12 experience like if you could take us back through that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I talk about this a lot in the book. I'm from Spokane, Washington.
Yeah.
Very, very homogenous area, land of Rachel Dolezal, if you know who that is. So you can only imagine. And I did not have an experience where I felt like my culture or just myself was accepted in a school environment. It was very much like take off yourself at the door when you come into the door, when you cross the threshold. And I was learning multiple things. I was learning the curriculum, but I was also learning how to navigate predominantly white spaces. And I've been
Yeah.
navigating predominantly white spaces since that time. I went to 3 PWIs for all of my degrees. So I have always had to learn to code switch and learn that second culture. And it was and I it gave me a lot of benefits, right? Like I am able to navigate those spaces and I've been successful, but then at the same time the cost that I paid was very, very high. I did not
Mhm.
experience, I have never had, to this day I've never had a black teacher. I never had teachers that understood culturally responsive teaching. I had really good teachers in like a evaluation type of way, like they would have gotten really good scores, but unfortunately being culturally responsive, being anti-racist, or even being pro-feminist is not a criteria for a teaching credentialing program. They give credentials out to racists every day. And so I was on the
Mm.
receiving end of that, especially being from a very homogenous area. And it was actually that experience that led me to look around and say, wait a minute, if I got this far, how far could I have gotten if I had a black teacher believing in me? Like if I did
Yeah.
all of this, what could I really have done if I had teachers that didn't look at my culture like it was a deficit, that saw me as a black woman and thought like this is something that she's bringing to the table, not something we have to overcome. We don't have to overcome her low income background or overcome her being a black woman, but rather these are assets. And so that's what really led me to understand what our students are experiencing. And I had very nice teachers. And so this is another point that I like to drill home with people. It has nothing to do with how nice you are. You can be a very nice white or black or brown person, but that has nothing to do with you being equitable. And I think people get those two things confused because they think, well, I love all of my students, but that doesn't, you can't vote for policies that harm your students and love them. You cannot ask your students to leave their culture at the door and love them. You cannot say you don't see race and love your students. That's not what loving them looks like. So I did have a lot of teachers that I'm sure would say that they, enjoyed me and they loved me and they were very nice older white ladies. Great experience, but that had nothing to do with valuing who I was as a person. And still to this day, I struggle with people that will say, I don't even see you as a black person, right? And I'm kind of like, please do, by all means, see me as a black person. So I think all is that to say, it is so critical that folks recognize that you can be a good teacher by these standards. You can go to a prestigious school and get the MED, you can get an EDD, but that doesn't mean that you don't have work to do and internal work to do when it comes to being actively anti-racist, equitable, or even joyful in the classroom. So I need people to hold those two things and to really be excited about doing both. Like it's great. There's so much more to learn. The internal work is never done. So that means there's always
Yeah.
something more for you to learn about, to discover, to unpack. And it could be a really fun process if you let it. But don't fool yourself into thinking that you loving your students begins and ends with having Black kids in the classroom or throwing up a couple pictures of MLK on your wall or even having diverse books in your library. Like, it's much deeper than that.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's the point where, for me, I've seen in my experience, whether it's a school I'm working with or whatever have you, where there are teachers who, if I gave them the questionnaire that asked them
Mm-hmm.
about their teacher, if I could go back and look at their interview process, they would have told me, oh, I love kids. I love how, how I really enjoy, I live
Yes.
for that. They would have
Oh,
told you all
yes.
of that. And then you see that same teacher when they've been set off, or when a student has kind of tap danced on their last nerve, right? They'll come out into the hallway, they'll have a conversation with the kid, and the conversation becomes, and you get into that in this. You talk about how we relate in those moments, either in emotion,
Yes.
right? And we
Emotion
see
and
it
escalation. Yep.
in escalation. That second one,
Yep.
that's the one I really want to harp on real quick for a second, because
Yeah.
it becomes this contest, and in that contest it must be conquest, right? That's it. So I'm going to shut you down. I'm going to have, and I
Have
can
the
do that
last
with
word.
that's it. And then that struggle, what you see is, what happened to all the love you said that you had when you first got into this classroom? What happened to all the love you said you had when you hung up that Black Lives Matter poster in your classroom?
Speak
What
on
happened
it.
to all of that? Right? Do you really love, or is it performative?
Mm-hmm.
And for me, that's the struggle,
Yeah.
is getting people beyond the performance to
Yes.
actually interrogating those things.
Right, right. And I mean, and I'm in California, performative allyship capital of the world, because nobody wants to. I mean, here it's still not okay to be racist. I understand there's parts of the United States where now you can just let it all hang out. Here
Yeah.
it is not appropriate. And a lot of teachers don't like, so they judge their relationship building skills, or they judge their responsiveness with the student, like with their, the teacher's assistant student, the one that's always there and that they like the family, and that is great. And I love that you have that relationship. But I've met a lot of teachers that insist that they have really healthy classroom cultures, but then they're kicking out the same 3 kids. And they're like, oh, well, when so-and-so is not here, the culture is great. Babes, then the culture is not great. Like, it's all of us or none, everybody's got to be included. So I think a lot of folks need to recognize that it involves those gritty, nitty-gritty, everyday moments, and your intentions and your intent can have very little to do with your impact. You might wake up and you might think, oh, I would have voted for Obama a third time, right? But then if you get in the faculty lounge and you're talking about like those parents, and it's always the Black boys that are getting kicked out of your class, there's a disconnect there, and that's okay. The point of this is not to like shame anybody. It's to help you realize that you need to handle that cognitive dissonance, and there's people that, like you and I, right, who help you walk through that. But you need to be realistic with yourself and really understand that that is what's going on. And that includes Black and brown teachers too, because you can have an all Black school and a predominantly white institution, because you're just replicating those same harmful processes that we've experienced. So it's really, really critical. I love that you brought up, this the performative aspect of it, and understanding that like your emotions can get the best of you. And when I have these really tough conversations with a teacher, 9 times out of 10, it's actually a conversation about your emotions. Like it could be the littlest thing in if you zoom out, like what is actually happening with the student, not to minimize people's experience, but it's not really that big of a deal. It's more about all like the perfect storm of like, I've told him this so many times, and then I was late, and we had indoor recess, so nobody got to go outside, and I'm supposed to have a sub, and I'm not feeling good, but I don't have sub plans. And it's all of this going into it. And so I implore teachers to recognize that like how you show up in those moments says more about your practice than it does when everything is going well. And to be human is to have emotions, to be escalated. But if you're not aware of it and you're letting it run you, that's when we have a problem. And we do the same thing with students, right? We talk about like, are you having a big feeling? Like point to the moodometer. We teach them all of these skills, but we forget to use those on ourselves. And so
Yeah.
I encourage folks to recognize that like sometimes it is not the kids. They're not doing it to bother you. Don't take it personally. What's happening is you're a human and you're having a very human reaction, but because you're in a position of power, that human reaction has an impact on 30 other kids. And because you really create the weather in your classroom, it's important for you to be mindful of that. So I think the worst thing someone could do is hear this and say, like, oh, no, that doesn't happen to me, because it probably does. It's human. So it's okay. I don't want folks to think like we're saying that you have to be an emotionless robot. Obviously not. You
Right.
have to be self-aware, though, like, and recognize your intent and how you think you are and all the books that you read, and your best friend is Black. That has nothing to do with some of the actions that you're doing in the classroom.
Yeah. Yeah. And to your point, and with your point is, don't believe that simply because you present a certain way that you're excluded from the work of doing real anti-racist equity work.
Right.
I have seen folks who look just like the people on this screen who have exacted tremendous amounts of harm on students and then wonder why they don't resonate, why kids aren't connecting and everything like that. Right.
Right.
The amount of and people are saying it in the chat, right? The amount of just the lack of awareness, the self-reflection that is needed to then look at what you did, look at the damage of and see, is there a better way to do this thing that I am trying to do? Right. But that
Yeah,
takes a lot of humility,
it does. It
right? And
does.
I don't know that we do that in education. We don't do that too well.
And I think it's hard, especially for folks of color, because we get caught up in thinking, well, I'm a person of color, and I've had to talk to, I've had to have long conversations with specifically Black folks who work in predominantly Latinx areas, where they have to understand, like, you have privilege as somebody who, is who speaks the dominant language. Your students, if they're not speaking English at home, have a totally different experience of you, and just because you're two people of color doesn't mean you can override that. And on the flip side, I've had to have conversations about anti-Blackness in the Latinx community. I've had to have conversations. I mean, at the first school I taught at in Oakland, it was literally like the United Nations. It was like a third Black, a third Asian, a third like Latino. I mean, everybody was there. And there was a lot of moments where people had to realize, okay, even as a person of color, I don't understand every single intersection. Or as a member of the LGBTQ community, I've had teachers that have been like, well, I'm gay, so I understand this intersection. And yes, you do have some understanding, but that has almost nothing to do with your whiteness. You're still white, so we have to unpack that. Or there's just so many levels. And I encourage folks to read about intersectionality, Kimberly Crenshaw, if you're not familiar, but
Hmm.
learn about intersectionality a little bit, and then recognize that, like, everyone has learning to do, myself included. All these books, I still be reading. Still every
Yeah.
day. I just bought 3 new books off of Amazon to get better today. So you have to commit to that and understand that you are never done. And we have to wrestle with the reality that as teachers, we are the experts, right? We're in the field, but just because you're an expert doesn't mean you don't have anything to learn. So I think that's what a lot of teachers kind of get stuck with, especially veteran teachers. You've done it 10 times. Okay, 10-year vet, 20-year vet, that's amazing. But that doesn't mean that you still don't have things to learn. Or you grew up in an urban neighborhood, okay, still have things to learn. Or, you you grew up in this type of area, still have things to learn. So that humility piece is really important. And I think it's
Yeah.
hard for teachers because we feel, because our profession is kind of targeted in a lot of ways. I mean, we went from being superheroes during the pandemic to everybody saying, like, oh, they're overpaid, they get all these vacation days. So I think because a lot of folks experience the outer world's perception that teachers, are babysitters or get paid too much or have all these vacation days, it makes us really defensive when somebody's calling us in to actually get better. But you have to recognize, like, humility is the only way forward. Otherwise, you're going to burn yourself out.
Yeah. Yeah. And with that expertise and with the assumption that we can't grow or whatever, this assumed level of I have it together, right? I I've been in rooms with educators talking to them about exercises and things that we can be going through to grow, And an educator will look me dead in my eye sockets and tell me, I don't need that. I don't need that. I don't need to unpack a standard. I don't need to do this. And I don't need to do. And I'm like, okay, cool. But let me ask you this. If I were to ask your students, are they learning and growing in your classroom? Would they have the answer that they don't that equates with what you're telling me? Does that reconcile?
Mm-hmm.
Right. And if you were to ask that teacher that, I know that person would turn around and give me all the excuses in the world as to why students aren't learning in their classroom. And I struggle so much with that because I just miss when we would have a no holds barred
Yeah.
commitment to you are going to learn in my class. It
Right.
brings it to my second point because when it talks to like like the emotional regulation piece of that same teacher being in the hallway talking to a student, it becomes more about proving a point than giving grace and space and understanding and de-escalation. You say this in your book and I love it. A regulated adult could pull a child from a burning building without emotional harm. A dysregulated adult could traumatize a student with a scraped knee.
Mm-hmm.
I love that piece. Talk to us about just one, as you were writing that and in your experiences, I know you've seen some things. So talk to us about the context of
Seen some
that
things.
quote. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it just comes from having, I had a brief stint. It was not the job for me. I was a dean of discipline, not the job for me. But in that year that I had that role, I just saw how the energy that the teacher is bringing to the interaction changes everything. The
That part.
mindset, that's why there's an entire chapter on mindset. And I know somebody reading is like, this girl keep going on and on about mindset because it's so critical. I've seen how it can just totally shift in interaction. And when you're, as a teacher, come to a situation with a student, first of all, remembering that you're talking to a child. I think that's another thing that we kind of struggle with. We think that we're dealing with little adults, and the reality is you're in school to learn, to make mistakes. The purpose, school is not working if all of the kids are doing everything perfectly. That's scary. You should be concerned. Like, you're in school to make mistakes, to explore, to test it out. Like, you need to come with that kind of energy.
Yeah.
Recognize, okay, you're talking to an 8-year-old, you're talking to a 13-year-old whose brain is literally not fully formed. So they're not
Yep.
going to have the same rational processes as you have. And
Yep.
recognize that, this is somebody who has value, who deserves grace, even if they've done you dirty 1,000 times, even if even if they tore down your billboard yesterday or your bulletin board yesterday, even if even if their parent always brings them 10 minutes late and they come in, or even if they never have their lunch pail, whatever it is, they still are deserving of grace and love and care, and they
Yeah.
still matter, right? So when you have that attitude, when you de-escalate a student or you work with an escalated student, it totally shifts. When you are frazzled, when you are upset, when you are on 10, which happens because we're human, that child is responding to that energy. And so what I've seen teachers have kids that everyone has written off. Every IEP, every 504 on the planet, an aid all day, an aid at lunch, all of these accommodations. And I've seen teachers have absolutely no problems and say, we don't need any of this because there's no challenge for the student. They just need an understanding, level-headed, calm person to interact with. And then I've
Yeah.
seen students who are over enrolled in services, get kicked out, over discipline because they have a teacher that isn't recognizing their own emotional dysregulation that they're bringing. And so
Yeah.
I think what I hope more people understand is, like, as a teacher, you have such a responsibility. These are people's babies. These are people's lives. And it is our duty to unpack our own emotional baggage that we're bringing. I mean, when I talk to school leaders and district leaders, the first thing I ask is therapy covered in your health plan? Because my
Mm.
other belief is I think some of us just need a little bit more therapy, and that's okay. But I think as a caring profession, you should expect to need support. You should expect to have those moments. So it's so important to recognize the role that we play and that our kids are not, just wrong and deficient. And even
Yeah.
if there is something up with them, they're not disposable. I think
Yeah.
that's the most troubling. When we get that IEP, the gen ed teacher is ready to, great, no longer my problem. It's your
Yeah.
problem now. They are
Yeah.
ready to kick that kid out and never look back. But that's not
Yeah.
how it works. They all have value. And so I think when you start to think about that and understand that, you'll see how your practice radically transforms, and you'll actually have a community that's based on equity, belonging, and care, and not just a classroom full of kids that you're forcing to be compliant.
Yes. The piece about students that then become classified have IEPs and 504s and plans and things like that. That's a real big piece in real time for me, because I'm seeing educators respond with, I'm going to use the language of, I want to move out from under the pressure of having to support that. And
Yes.
now this classification gives it to someone else. And now I'm free.
Yep.
And the kid could not have even moved classes.
Right.
The kid
Mind
could
you,
still, yeah.
mind you, still in their class the entire
Yeah,
day. Yeah. Yeah.
absolutely. It's still there. The kid is still there. And you are still seeing it as not your responsibility. You know, I was having a conversation today with, again, I was telling you, I had a conversation earlier, and in that conversation we were talking about the fact that, um like, I have two kids, right? Um my son Shane is 12. He's my engineer deep thinker. He
Nice.
lives in his head a lot. Like, that's him. And I love just seeing him come to life and how he figures out things and what he's been thinking about. My daughter, she's going to rule the world one day. Like that.
That's
She
right.
she is that is my baby girl, and she lives loud and out and in front, and she asks great questions, and she doesn't take no for an answer, and she figures out the best way to get to what she wants, and I love that about her. When I think about both of those kids, I think about if they came home and said to me, "Daddy, I don't understand what's happening in school."
Mm,
The first thing I'm going to do is have enough, knowledge to be able to call, to figure out what's happening, to navigate that system, and then I'm going to learn it so that I could teach it, so that I could
mhm.
support them, because
Yes.
my kids should not, my babies, my two, should not go without knowing, right? Like, that's the commitment I have. How would it look if I, as a school leader, as an educator, then
Mm,
went to a school and said, it's okay if these kids go without? Like, I think we forget that our
yes.
families are giving us the best that they
Yes.
have. They're giving our best, surrendering it to
Right.
us. And we look at them and say, "Yeah, they didn't get it because they
Hmm.
didn't want to. They didn't get it because, and then we give a bunch of excuses as to why."
Excuses.
You
So
know what I
many.
mean? Um,
Yeah.
so with that, I wanna ask you, if that's our mindset, what
Hmm.
helps us reclaim what helps us reclaim a commitment to, no, no, these are my kids too, and in a healthy sense, these are my kids, and I'm going to ensure that they have the best while they're here.
Yeah, I think it comes down to so much agency. I think as teachers, we're so used to not having agency, to feeling a lack of agency, to feeling out of control, that we kind of almost start to participate in that. And so I encourage everyone to, one, recognize there are things that you can do.
Yeah,
There, find a way or make one. If there is not a way that you have found, we will make a way. And I think that tenacity, that stick to itiveness, that grit is, we always talk about the kids need to have grit. We need to have a little grit. Okay. We kind of lost a little bit in that. And I think,
mhm,
one of my opinions is all of the social media venting and all of that is kind of feeding into that, because we want
yeah,
to put our feet up and say it's someone else's problem. And let me tell you what I also see: a lot of technology, a lot of, oh, they're going to do iReady, they're going to do Epic, they're going to do ST Math, they're going to do whatever program, IXL, and that's going to do the learning. the compute that there are so many studies that show that kids learn better on pencil and paper, but as teachers we're so used to giving it up, giving away our students with disabilities to the sped team, giving the students to the computer to say, hey, you fix it, you fix these gaps, these as soon as you cross second grade, it's all about the gaps. Everything is all the gaps that they have. So we're giving over the filling of the gaps to these computer learning management systems. We're just kind of throwing our hands up a little bit. And I want folks to recognize that, like, you are in charge of your classroom in so many ways. And those are the best teachers. The best teachers are the ones that roll up their sleeves, that get a little scrappy. And please don't hear that I'm saying that there are not systemic barriers to this. I am very much aware that there are all kinds of barriers to this happening, whether it be being overworked, burnt out, evaluations, lack of support, all of those things exist. But you know what? We have done more with less. We have helped those kids learn through a pandemic. We were on Zoom, y'all, teaching. Okay. So now that we're in person, I believe in our ability to do it, but I need teachers to reconnect with their agency. And I think that some of that also just comes from being burnt out. So when I do my work, I start with you. Everything is starting with the internal work, with building your practice as a reflective practitioner, and with saying, like, where is your joy? Because if you are coming into the classroom and your cup is empty and you got about 2 milliliters, that's not going to cut it. So I encourage teachers to, that's why I said, go to therapy, do your own practice, do what makes you feel joyful. What are you doing this week? Do you even enjoy teaching? Is this a job that you're enjoying? Right? You need to get right with yourself, because another thing that almost all of the really highly effective instructional leaders that I've seen are good on the outside of school. When 3 o'clock hits, they're also good. They're feeling good and positive about their life and things going on. So bringing that agency starts with, like, reclaiming yourself, reclaiming your own joy, and making sure that you're filling up your cup so that way you can show up and be the best you that you have for your students. Your students need you at your best. And so that is definitely the first step.
You know, when we have these conversations about whether it be culturally sustaining pedagogy, whether it be restorative practices, anti-racist teaching, centering joy in our classrooms, many educators hear it as just another thing. You're asking me to do this other thing, and to, in a sense, it is teachers listening to us with their triggers and traumas before they actually hear us out,
Mm-hmm.
because they've been given another thing every year. We're going to try this new thing. This is going to be the thing that gets us to where we want to be. We'll try this new thing, and rinse and repeat. So when we come in and we say something like, no, we actually need to be listening with empathy. We actually need to be providing grace and space. We actually need to center joy. These come through a teacher's ears as just another thing. So my question for you is, when we talk about this idea of centering joy, how do we combat that ideology of it being just another thing?
Mm-hmm.
And secondly, you describe it as the secret ingredient in
Yeah.
equity work. I would
Yes.
love for you to talk about that as well.
Yeah, I like to say it's not just another thing, it's how you do everything.
Yeah.
So it's how you do everything in your classroom. It's not a list of practices to check off. It's a philosophy, it's a way of being, it's a mindset, it's beliefs. And that's what makes it a little bit, I think, challenging for people, because they're like, well, where's the checklist of the joyful and inclusion? And, like, I can give you some ideas, but a classroom is only as joyful and inclusive as its leader. A
My
curriculum is only
mind.
as culturally responsive as the teacher teaching it, right? So, excuse me. So it's really important that you recognize that it is a way of being. And once you shift your mindset, once you start to prioritize joy in your own life, once you start to see the value of joy, once you start to humanize your students, it won't feel like another thing, because it's the way that you're doing, it's the way that you're moving in the classroom. And once you start doing that, it also makes it easier and more sustainable. I mean, this is the other piece. Don't you think it would feel good to come into your classroom and feel joyful and excited? Wouldn't it feel good if all of your kids felt welcome and included, and you didn't have kids burning down the classroom, metaphorically speaking, of course, because they don't feel welcome, so they're turning up because they're like, hey, I'm not part of this community anyway, so I might as well, cut up. it would feel good to bring that back. It would feel good to feel like you were the expert and kids were learning. It feels good when kids learn from you. So all of these things like help it make it more sustainable. Um, so I like to also touch on that as well, because it's not like it's not more prep work for you to do at the
That
end of
part.
your day. It's a way of being. And I call it the secret ingredient in equity work as well, because a lot of folks, when we first started to relook at equity work, a lot of us were doing it long before that, but in
Right.
2020 it became very trendy. It was A lot of folks felt like equity work just meant listing off all of the horrible things that have ever happened to Black people in this country or Black and brown people in this country. And then they think that Black History Month means we got to talk about slavery and reenact segregation and like reenact, like, that is not. So when I say joy is a secret ingredient to equity work, what I mean is we're moving away from this idea that Black and brown people are just a collection of all of their traumas. And these are all these awful things that we have to overcome and subvert. But rather, we're recognizing that within the community, joy has always been resistance. By liberating our students and giving them spaces to thrive, we're actually breaking down these systems that are stopping what's already naturally happening, because kids
Yeah.
come to school joyful, ready to learn. Again, Black and brown people are joyful. It's white supremacy that's taking it away. It's not like we need to be taught to be joyful. We're not given the opportunity to do so. So when I say joy is a secret ingredient, it's recognizing like this is already within you and your students. And when you get out of the way and get some of that stuff out of the way, it's able to flourish and grow. And it makes equity work much more meaningful than just, listing out all of these terrible things that have ever happened, or just, going down a list of negative experiences. It's so much more than that. And it can be really joyful because it's allowing people to be the fullest versions of themselves. What's more
Yeah.
joyful than that?
Yeah. Yeah. I think about, as you were talking, it made me reflect on when I knew my classroom wasn't hitting that target for me.
Mm,
Um, I think that this is important to say, because I think when folks see people like you and I talking about these matters, they assume a level of expertise and things like that. And yes, we know what we're talking about, but at the same time, there's always room to grow and improve and reflect, and like these are things that we live by.
yes, still very much
Uh,
aware.
Absolutely. Like I'll give you an example that was even this year, real time for me. We have a dress code and this dress code is you can't wear hoodies, and it became an issue for people. And I'm like, new administrator, new word administrator, trying to make sure that I'm making proper inroads, gain certain levels of respect with people, so I can then begin to do certain things. I'm like, all right, cool, let's go at it. And I began to talk to students about it, and then I began to tell them, like, listen, this is what we need to do, and then I began to hold them accountable to it. And then I started looking at, like, the damage of this, because I'm like, well, why am I taking this hoodie? Like, really, why am I doing this? Like what is it doing to the kid? One, what learning is being helped by the fact that I'm removing this hoodie? And I'm telling you, as someone who is sitting here that does this work, that thinks about this thing, that
Mhm.
I have fallen into these practices and had to reflect to then do some work and be like, nah, this ain't right.
Right.
My
Absolutely.
thing in saying that to you is I think that there are folks who are listening who will say, who will assume that this work isn't for them because they have X amount of years, or because they've produced a certain amount of results, or because they get a certain evaluation, or and the list goes on. And my
Mhm.
question is is how can we begin to cultivate in folks the kind of space in their hearts and minds to say, maybe there's more, and
Right.
maybe there's better, and I can keep going after this thing.
Right, right. Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing that. I had a same, it was the hoodies for me too. Like I think it was also my first year as an AP. I was the hoodie police. And I was like, why am I mean, sometimes I really encourage people to step back and say, why are you doing some of these things? What does it do? Is it hurting me? I mean, I like it's even kids moving their bodies in the classroom is another one. Like there's so many policies that are just carceral because they're about control. They're not about
Yeah.
community. They're not about harm reduction. They're literally about this because I said so, so you gonna do it. So
Yep.
it's really important for folks to recognize and to continue to do that work. And I just encourage people to fall in love with the process, fall in love with learning, fall in love with feedback, fall in love with growing, fall in love with getting better, fall in love with getting excited when a new scholar that you like writes a book or an article with the data. Build community. Have your teacher advocacy group. I encourage people to have a group of teachers, read a book together, and then pick a project. Every year, pick a project like, hey, this is a project that I'm going to do that's going to help my school get better. For me, when I was a teacher, the first year we moved from like letter grades, traditional letter grades, to standards-based grading. That was our project. We got all the data and all of the stuff. We did a whole little presentation. The next year, I was a part of a group that got inquiry-based play in K2 at a school. So there's lots of different ways to feel that agency. And I encourage you guys to just really look and see how it can be such a beautiful and exciting thing to learn and grow. And the more you do it on your own, the more authentic it'll be when you're encouraging the kids to do it. Because aren't we always telling them like learning can be fun? Like you have to like it, you have to enjoy it. You need to also lead by example and do that yourself as well. So I encourage people to just fall in love with the process, fall in love with mastering your craft, fall in love with getting better and growing as an instructional leader and as a classroom culture facilitator, because that will make it so much easier and so much more rewarding. And again, it's better with friends, it's better with a community. So even if that has to be a virtual community, because maybe you're somewhere rural where these things, where they've banned equity. One district told me that they banned the word equity, so they were like, can you take the word equity out of all your stuff? I'm like, y'all are insane. So try, if you're somewhere where that kind of thing is happening, do an online community.
Yeah.
Find people online that you can bond with. But it is so critical to recognize that this work is really our profession, and if you let it, it can be so rewarding, it can be so wonderful and transformative. But if you bump up against it over and over again with this kind of mentality, that it's just another thing to do, you're going to burn yourself out.
100%. 100%. I I I think about, to your point, the aspect of community.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason I think about this is, for us, for folks in the diaspora, community has been a way of life,
Mm-hmm.
right? A way of survival, a way of
Yeah.
thriving. It is literally embedded in our DNA. And when I talk about community and I try to relate it to folks, I say the community happens when I make your problem my problem. When I
I
make
love
your
that.
joy my joy.
I love
When
that.
I do that, then we're in community.
Yes.
You are talking in your book about building classroom communities. And I think folks kind of struggle with that idea because they miss that concept.
Mm-hmm.
They miss the idea of what it means to actually, what community is and how to build that. And I know you talk a lot about that in your book, but speak to that for us, for folks who are listening and are like, all right, cool, I hear y'all, you've convinced me, I want to start tomorrow. What are some things that they really should be considering in order to build that classroom of belonging, of joy, of inclusion?
Yeah. Okay. First of all, I love what you said. Your joy, my struggle is your struggle. Absolutely. That is what a true classroom community looks like. And it doesn't always have to be harmonious. I think that's
Yeah,
another piece too. It doesn't mean that you don't have norms. It doesn't mean that people don't do things. It doesn't mean that harm doesn't happen. It means that when harm does happen, you handle it in a collective, humanizing way. So
that part.
I don't want folks to listen and think like, oh, Deonna's thinking my classroom is going to be perfect. No, ma'am. It'll probably be chaotic. It'll be messy because being in community with people is messy. Think about, as an adult, the bigger your friend group is, the more drama you have, right? Like the bigger the group is, the more it's messy. But like that's
Yeah,
some of the beauty of it. So I think that just understanding that, the call is not this perfect little kumbaya place where everybody's sitting in their carpet square exactly right. The call is for a place where everybody truly feels valued and that they matter. And so I think some steps that you could take, concrete steps off the top of my head. The first would be checking in with yourself.
hmm
You can also buy Rooted in Joy if you'd like to, and that'll help you do that as well. But you can check in with yourself and start to think about what energy you are bringing to the classroom, being mindful about that. You can start by asking your students. And sometimes people are like, oh, if I ask my kids, they're just going to say like they just want to play, the Fortnite all day. And it's like, you might get some wacky answers from the kids, but sometimes, like 9 times out of 10, you're going to get a couple really insightful, good answers. So I would say, ask your students how they feel. Do they think the community is joyful? Do they feel like they belong? Do they feel cared for? And brainstorm ways about making that happen. And then I would go by item for all of your policies and practices that you have in your classroom, especially on the community end, and ask yourself, is this a rule that's about community, or is this a rule that is about control? Just that simple question, reflection. And if it's about control, start to unpack about how you can like take people away from that, because that's not probably helping to build your community. And then think about those students that you really struggle with and ask yourself, like, are these struggles related to the fact that perhaps the student doesn't feel like they have a place, doesn't feel cared for by me? Is that potentially one of the reasons why they are, having a hard time? So just starting with 1 or 2 students, or starting with 1 or 2 days a week where you're going to intentionally include community building practices. Because sometimes we think, oh, the community is built, I built it in September, we good. Absolutely not. Like, you should be doing things daily, weekly, monthly, and yearly to continue to foster that community. So start with 1 student, start with 1 day, and then start with those reflective questions for yourself to try to figure out where you're at in all of this work.
Yeah, I think there is a sense in which we could excuse ourselves by looking at systemic flaws. We could excuse ourselves by looking at societal flaws. We could excuse ourselves by looking at government and legislative flaws. We can excuse ourselves by looking at so much. Um, but there is something in
Yeah.
your control. There is something in your
Yes.
locus of control that you can do
Yes.
today. And so I highly recommend this work along to add that to your library. Um, and and I want to uh, ask you one last question before I want you to, and then I want to ask you a question, and then I want you to plug, your work, your book, and how folks can connect with you. If you were going back in time and
Mm.
you looked at yourself as an educator, the first year of teaching, and you could give yourself one piece of advice, what would it be?
Mm. That's a great question. I think that what I would go back in time and tell to myself my first year of teaching was, again, I was from the like teach like a champion, uncommon schools, slant, old, old, like very much everything, not a thing out of place, wait for 100% type of instructional background. That's what I was taught to do.
Yeah.
And as a Black woman, my thought process was, I have to hold my kids to this crazy standard because that's what they'll experience. I have to prepare them. They have to be ready
That
for
part.
this very hostile white world that's dominated by white supremacy culture. Again, if you don't know much about white supremacy culture, I'm not talking about white people. I'm talking about whiteness, and you should look that up and learn a little bit about that. But I just thought that it was my duty to prepare them because I was, kind of out there in the trenches for a while and struggling through going to different PWIs. So my thought process was, if I just am like hard enough on them, then when they go somewhere else, they'll understand. Especially, I was in 5th grade too, right? So I'm thinking, okay, as a 5th grade teacher, I need to make sure like to get them ready. Like I was always getting them ready for middle school. And I should have like recognized, like, yeah, get them ready, but also like, where are they now?
Yeah.
Why replicate a toxic environment that they're going to experience instead of just letting them enjoy having a teacher that actually values where they come from right now?
Yeah. Yeah.
Why like pretend this is a middle school classroom and suck a lot of the joy out of their very last opportunity to be in elementary school? And a lot of times that's where the shift happens, from elementary to middle school. No shade to my middle school crowd, because I'm also part of y'all, but that's the truth. Middle school is kind of where it takes a turn, where it goes from being this community oriented place to you're very much just a number. And so I think I would tell myself like to like get a chill pill, like recognize like I don't need to be doing all of this. And my kids could have been prepared and still had a joyful and inclusive experience. Like I could have prepared them and still recognized their humanity a little bit more. And I talk about this in the book. I mean, I could have done a lot more of that. So that would be my advice to myself. But again, I want to highlight my intentions were good. My intentions were like very much, okay, this is what they need. I'm setting them up for success. But that's why intent versus impact is so important, because that was not my impact. My impact was they had yet another teacher that was replicating these harmful systems. So I think that's the advice that I would give to myself.
That's real big, real key. I think I resonate so much with it. I appreciate you sharing, vulnerably, especially because we're all works in progress. And so thank you for demonstrating that. Thank you for the love, the intention of this book. Um, and thank you for also living and breathing what it is you're putting out there. I think we've talked about this many times, but there are folks who want liberation as long as it's lucrative, who want who want all these things as long as you can put your name attached to it, or you can experience some type of accolade for it. So thank you for being in the trenches and doing the work that you're doing and all of that. So I just want to say that to you publicly. I appreciate you, I honor you, and I want to highly recommend your book to folks. So with that, please
Thank
tell
you.
folks how they can connect with you and support your work.
Yeah. And thank you so much for just allowing me to use this platform and to chat with you. I love whenever we get to chat. And I'm just glad that, this friendship that we started, I think in 2020 is still hanging in there, even though the tides have changed a little bit on this work. I love that we're still
Yeah.
hanging in there. So I'm so grateful for you in this like little internet space. And yeah, I would love to connect with everyone. If you're on LinkedIn, my name is just Dr. Deonna Smith. On Instagram, it's just Deonna Smith as well. And yeah, I would love to continue to support folks in any way possible. I do this work with schools and districts, and I enjoy, like, I do instructional coaching and also professional development workshops and that kind of thing. And the first next best step is to, like I said, follow me here on socials and then pick up Rooted in Joy. It's available on Amazon, Target, Barnes and Noble. And if you'd like to support a Black-owned business, again, highly recommend you can check out Mahogany Books. It is stocked in Mahogany Books, and they do ship nationwide in the US. So you can support a Black-owned business. Well, two, me, myself, and also Mahogany Books, if you would like to. And yeah, let's connect. I love working and chatting with folks about this work. And wherever you are at, I believe that this work is for everyone. So we had a relatively advanced conversation, but I like to say wherever you're coming to the work is valid. So if you're just somebody who's still trying to learn more, or you don't have a frame of reference, or your basic question of what is anti-racist teaching, like, let's do it. Let's engage, let's in dialogue together, because I believe deeply in being a community with folks, regardless of what they're bringing to the table and where they're coming from as well.
100%. Please support my sis. Grab this book. And there, like we said, there are a bunch of schools that need the work that she does. So let's do that, man. Let's support the
Do
work.
it.
I appreciate you, sis. Thank you for sharing space. And thank you so much for everyone who tapped in and those who tap into the replay. It's needed. So thank you so much.
Yes, awesome. Thank you.